Yat Mark Charles in a shia. Sin beked in a nishlim, the Tohiglini Bashashin. Sin beked in a Bashache, the Todachini Bashanale. In Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you talk about your family. We are a matrilineal society, and so we are our mother's mother. That's our identity. My mother's mother was the grandchild of an immigrant from the Netherlands. She was an American. In Navajo, usually we just say Bilagana, but we also have a very descriptive language. And during the World War II, when the code talkers were making up the code, they named the different countries that were both on either side of the war. So the Germans were the metal hat people, and the Italians were the people who stutter, and there's stories behind all of these things. But anyway, there was no name for the Dutch. So when I became old enough and I wanted to introduce myself as a Dutch man, I had to find a way to say it. So I spoke with some of my relatives, and we decided on Sin Bekeh Dana'a. Sin is wood or sticks. Bekeh is shoes. And Dana'a is people. So among my people, I introduced myself as being from the Wooden Shoe Clan. My mother's mother was raised in Chicago. She lived there during the 30s, 40s, and 50s. She worked for Reverend Elderveld, who was the, I believe, first preacher of the Back to God Hour. She wasn't even his secretary. She just stuffed envelopes for his secretary for a few years there. And she was raised in the Christian Reformed Church. Her parents and grandparents went to the church back when they spoke only Dutch. And she was raised there, and she raised her children there. And when she moved later in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, to Denver, Colorado, she worked as a secretary at Bethesda Hospital, which was a hospital established by the Christian Reformed Church. They were members of 2nd CRC in Denver, Colorado. They lived about 4 houses down from the church. They were very involved. And she raised her daughter to be involved. My mother went to college and went into nursing school, I believe at Blodgett, if I remember correctly. And she felt that God wanted to call her as a missionary to Africa. But she went to Rehoboth to first get her feet wet in a foreign culture. And she met this pretty cute Navajo guy there named Ted Charles, and ended up never making it to Africa. Koaheglini Bashashin, that's my father's mother. Koaheglini is the water that flows together. My grandmother, May Casimero was her maiden name, was taken from her home and put into a boarding school. I don't know if taken from, but she was in school, the government school. And it was in those schools that she first heard about Jesus. And from what she told me, she went home and told her father, her family, about this God that they learned about in school. And her father, over time, became a believer. And she became a believer and was one of the early members of the Christian Reformed Church in Crown Point, New Mexico. This was back in the 1930s. She was raised in that church. And she was a member of the Christian Reformed Church until she died back in the late 80s, no, the early 90s, when she passed away. Sin Beked Na is also my grandfather's clan. Technically in Navajo, you're not allowed to marry within your same clan, but I guess they did it in the Netherlands, so we couldn't control that. Interesting side note, the Netherlands is about roughly the same size as the Navajo reservation. Our reservation is about 26,000 square miles, which is roughly the same size as the Netherlands. My grandfather, John Nadelborg, married my grandmother, May Nadelborg, in Chicago. And he was a quiet man, members of the Christian Reformed Church. They moved to Denver, Colorado in the late 40s. And his father and his parents already lived in Denver. And his father was a maintenance man at Bethesda Hospital. After he retired, my grandfather took a job at Bethesda Hospital, worked there as a maintenance man until he retired. Did courier, picked up people from the airport, just did all errands around the city for the hospital. They're also members of Second Christian Reformed Church. He was never a leader in the church, and I asked my mother why, and he said, well, your grandfather had sleep apnea. And so he didn't sleep good at night, and so he would always fall asleep in church. And so they could never make him an elder because he was sleeping too much. But he was a very devout member of that congregation, raised his family in the church. And I think the perfect image of my mother's father's side of the family in the church is my uncle, who worked also as a maintenance man at Bethesda Hospital. Bethesda slowly began changing their focus, and I think first they were a tuberculosis hospital, and then they went into some psychiatric care, I believe, and they began getting smaller and smaller and using less and less of the campus. And my uncle was a maintenance man there, and they began laying off people, and they began shutting down buildings, and finally they decided to close the hospital. And through all of these rounds of layoffs, my uncle kept his job. Until finally, he was the only employee left. Because it was such a beautiful campus, they didn't want it to go into blight, and so they kept my uncle hired to maintain the campus, to maintain the buildings, to cut the grass. He was the only employee. And eventually they sold it to a school, and the school kept my uncle on for a few years to help the new maintenance team transition to care for this campus. I think that's a perfect image of my mother's father's side of the family in the Christian Reformed Church. Wasn't a leader, wasn't in the center of things, but was always there, always present, just always a part of things.
Joys and blessings.
Come to cheat me? Bitterwater. That's my grandfather. The Bitterwater clan. My grandfather was a very progressive Navajo. Raised in a very poor family in a very remote part of the reservation, he was put into boarding school at a very young age and forced to choose a birthday and an American name. All he knew was he was born around the turn of the century in the spring, so we chose March of 1900, or he chose that. His name was John Charles because there were two teachers in the school named John and Charles, and that was his name. He was very progressive. He learned English fluently. He actually attended 2 years of college. He played the cello. My grandfather, a Navajo, born in a Hogan, somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, going to college and playing the cello. He worked for the government for years, helping sign up other Navajos to work in different parts of the country and get jobs off of the reservation. In the 40s, he became a Christian after he married my grandmother. He became a Christian at Shiprock Christian Reformed Church in Shiprock, New Mexico. While he was there, he actually worked with Wycliffe to translate the Bible into Navajo. Later, they moved to Rehoboth, and my grandfather retired from his job with the government and took a job translating for the early missionaries. He was assigned to a missionary, and he would go around with him translating English, his words into Navajo. And sometimes he was accused by the translators of adding to the message, to the translation, because the missionaries didn't understand that the Navajo language is a descriptive language. So you don't just have a term for predestination or total depravity. So what the English pastor could say in 1 or 2 words would take my grandfather 3 or 4 minutes to describe it and to draw the picture of what that looked like. And he was accused of, why are you adding to our message? Later, he was assigned to another missionary, Reverend Gordon Stite, who is still a very treasured member, our friend of our family. And my grandfather, my father was telling me the story that he would go, and they would go to these meetings, and I think it was once a month, the missionaries would come together in New Mexico and Arizona, and they would sit around this table. And they would talk about their mission, and they would make decisions about what was going to happen. And my grandfather would come home so frustrated because he was never allowed to sit at the table. He had to sit against the wall with the other Navajo translators as someone outside of that circle, not included in that conversation. But he stayed with that job. He continued translating for the missionaries. And he worked there until he retired. My father was a teacher in the public school on the reservation. He retired from that, and he got his license to exhort, and then got his I forget what the title is, but he began pastoring a small church just off the reservation. Isn't ordained, hasn't been to seminary. And yet he began leading his people and preaching in our congregation. I followed the same path, and I got my license to exhort. Began preaching around the reservation, and eventually was called to pastor a church in Denver, Colorado called the Christian Indian Center. Technically, I wasn't the pastor. I was an elder at another church on loan to the Christian Indian Center as a preaching elder. Tomato, tomato, call it what you want. I was the pastor of the church. Later, I moved back to the reservation, and I said, I'm not going back with any other organization because I don't want them telling me what mistakes to make. I want to make my own mistakes, new mistakes. And so I moved back to the reservation with my family and didn't connect myself with any other church or organization. And for 3 years we lived there. I didn't lead, I didn't teach, I just observed, I lived as a part of that community. And after 3 years, I felt God calling me to recommit back into the church. So we committed to Window Rock Christian Reformed Church. And I felt God calling me and saying, if you want to really change, make changes, you have to be involved. You have to be committed. I was very pleased when Jerry Dykstra called me a few years ago and said, Mark, there's an at-large membership on the board that's open. Would you consider being nominated for that position? I said, God, I didn't know that was what you're calling me to commit to. 3 years ago, I was a renegade out in the middle of nowhere, and now you're asking me to be a part of a board of a denomination. But I did, and I committed. Now, on one hand, it would be tempting to say that is so wonderful because my grandfather used to sit along the wall and watch the missionaries make the decisions, and now suddenly I, a Navajo man, am allowed to come and sit at this table. But I want to paint a different picture for you. Because that's not what I believe the image of the church is. It's easy to believe that the poor are down here and the rich are up here, and good Christians will go down to the poor and drop something off and then come back up. Really good Christians, really devout Christians will go down to the poor and try to lift them up here because the belief is this is where we should be. I would like to argue if these are the two places that Jesus sits right about here. Just above the poor, far below the rich and the wealthy and the educated. And if we really want to have a conversation between the rich and the poor, it's not about bringing the poor up into the same struggles and places of the rich. It's about elevating them a little bit and humbling the wealthy so we can sit at this table where Jesus sits, where decisions are truly made. And so the way I want to challenge you to look at what's happening with my own people and with me is not that I am being invited to come and sit at this table in the center. It's that the Christian Reformed Church, one by one, is coming to the wall and sitting where the people you serve are and taking your place on the outside of the circle where Jesus sits, where the decisions are really made. That's my family. It's a blessing to be a part of this church. There's a lot of problems. There's a lot of struggles. And it's not always the most pretty situation. But it's the church that God has called me and my family for decades, almost centuries, to commit to. And it's my joy and my privilege to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Amen.